KTBlackadder did a great video about the problems associated with God's omniscience and free will, so I'll put a link to that in the description, and I wanted to address an attempt made by William Lane Craig to get around this problem. The problem is, if God knows what you will do, and knows it infallibly, then doesn't that mean that you are not free to do otherwise?
Premise 1, necessarily, if God foreknows X, then X will happen. 2, God foreknows X. 3, therefore necessarily X will happen. And if X happens necessarily, it means it's not free. That commits a logical fallacy. From the two premises, you cannot deduce that necessarily X will happen. All that follows is simply X will happen, but not necessarily.
Well, let me put the argument another way. Premise 1, if God knows infallibly that X will happen, then X cannot fail to happen. Premise 2, God knows infallibly that X will happen. Therefore, conclusion, X cannot fail to happen. What's the difference between an event which cannot fail to happen and an event which happens necessarily? Those seem to mean the same thing.
It could fail to happen, but if it were to fail to happen, then God would have foreknown something different.
Yes, if an event were to fail to happen, God would have foreseen something different. But if God did not foresee something different, then the event he foresaw could not fail to happen.
So by your actions, you have the ability, by what you do, in a sense, to determine what God will have believed in the past.
Another way I've heard this argument expressed is that from God's perspective, everything you will do has already happened. He has already seen every event unfold. He doesn't really predict the future, rather he knows it postdictively. But this seems hard to square with Craig's theory of time. Craig believes in presentism, which says that the future is not real, only the present is real. But if from God's perspective, everything that's going to happen has already happened, then from God's perspective, the past, present, and future would all be equally real, which seems to contradict presentism. Also, if the events of the future are as real and exist just as much as those of the past or the present, then why wouldn't it be the case that the future is just as unalterable as the past or the present?
His knowledge is sort of like an infallible barometer of the weather. The barometer never fails. It's always right. But clearly, the barometer doesn't determine the weather.
Yes, an infallible barometer does not determine the weather in the sense of causing that weather. But I don't see how a barometer could infallibly predict the weather unless it measured some variable that did deterministically cause it. Or it measured a variable which is also determined by the same underlying factor that deterministically causes the weather. Even if the barometer didn't deterministically cause the weather, how could it predict it infallibly if the weather were not predetermined? Similarly, even if it is the case that God does not predetermine our behavior, if he knows that you are going to do something, then it is written in stone that that is what you are going to do, even if it wasn't written in stone by God himself.